Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of Bingley Talks Politics. And this week we're going to discuss politicians. It's Finn, you suggested this one for us, didn't you? We thought we could get some mileage out of this one, and is there something wrong with our politicians? Are our politicians getting worse? That sort of debate. You know, who are our politicians? What sort of people do we have running the country? And I suppose by politicians, are we really talking about MPs and the government? Is that what we mainly mean here?
Yeah, it's probably focused around people in what you would consider as the establishment.
Yeah, you could interpret it quite widely, couldn't you, and talk about councillors and people like that, but then it gets perhaps to broader discussion. Okay, the way I see it, gentlemen, is that there are maybe three things, maybe more, but I picked out three things where it might have gone wrong recently. We might do a bit of comparison between now and what we see as the recent past. So, why do we have a potential problem? There's a lack of trust from people towards their politicians. They don't really trust them. They're in it for themselves. The politicians are in it for themselves, the self-interest, and they're out of touch. They don't really connect with normal people. That's what I maybe thought were three major issues. Mr. Cook, what are your thoughts then on our current politicians?
I think so. The kind of skill set for politicians has kind of stayed the same, right, for a while now. It's basically PPE, right, politics, philosophy, economics kind of skill set. Now, that didn't seem too bad, especially in like the 1900s when crises moved a lot slower. But now we're dealing with things like, you've got AI, flash crashes, things like that. So is it that they're getting worse or that the problems are getting more and more complex for them to grapple with? I think it's an interesting question.
And it's more demanding. You need a wider skill set, we're suggesting, to perhaps deal with. I mean, if we look at the last 10 years, or go back to the financial crisis of, around 15 years ago, and look at the events that have happened there. I mean, two are immediately leaping out: the European Union, the Brexit, and then the pandemic. That needs quite a dynamic set of skills, doesn't it, for a politician to act almost like as a manager at certain points, and to, all the different skills required, the communication, the leadership. It's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly not to say that PP is not relevant. There's a huge area there where it is relevant and applicable, but I think it's the diversity of skill sets that we need. I think it's more, there's clearly a class of politicians that all kind of come from the same either education system, be it Oxford, Cambridge, that kind of thing.
So we think it's perhaps too narrow. I mean, you mentioned PPE as a degree that people get largely from Oxford or Cambridge, and if that's driving a large share of our politicians, we would be better if there was a wider background, so certain people with scientific qualifications, maths, other things, or no particular degrees at all. I mean, should there be more politicians from a working class background? And I'm not trying to make a generalisation. It sounded like that, working class people wouldn't have degrees, but what I mean from a background where they haven't gone to university. Finn, what do you think to that? I mean, would that?
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I mean, obviously you've got it's sort of, especially in Britain, it's kind of quite unique in how we have education's that privilege, isn't it? Like John Major, when he was Prime Minister, he was like greatly criticised because he only had a couple of GCSEs, didn't he? But he'd still managed to, make it large. I think really in Britain there is that stigma around education. I'd say it's more about, well, the proof is in the pudding. Are you a good politician or are you not? John Major, say what you like about him, but he managed to become Prime Minister on the back of 3 A-levels or O-levels in his time. He was obviously talented. He was obviously a talented politician, so I don't know.
Yeah, but when you look at them since Major, they are largely private school, not exclusively, and it's back to that quite narrow band of academic qualifications. People criticise Johnson as a classicist to be in charge of the pandemic. There's interesting arguments because there's pros and cons, aren't there, of people's background there. Let's just think about some of the issues that are affecting the quality of our politicians. Okay, here's a sort of direct question: is pay got something to do with it? Do we pay them enough? How much does an MP earn?
About 70 grand.
Something like that, isn't it?
Yeah, right about. I think, yeah.
Do you think people are instinctively say, well, that's quite a nice salary, but then I would say, well, it's quite a difficult job, and a pressured job and a time-consuming job, and I don't know whether the money would drive people into it.
Sorry. It's like what you mentioned with Johnson. You know, Johnson, before he became Prime Minister, which earns you about 150 grand a year, he was earning $500,000 a year writing articles. Arguably, writing an article every week is a lot easier than 24/7 being the Prime Minister. I mean, I'd argue that Johnson was just on holiday all the time, but he just wrote articles and he got $500,000 a year for it. So I'd say that's, there's obviously a wrong, you go back in time and politicians, they weren't paid because obviously it's like, you want the gentry, you want rich people to be in the jobs, and that locks other people out of it, and pay hasn't really risen to the extent that we'd want it to since then, because it's been like, politicians voting for a pay rise is sort of like...
There's a difficult thing there, particularly in the media, isn't there, if they do vote themselves a pay rise. I mean, no one would ever go into politics for the money, I'm guessing. That's not really something that happens, is it?
Hope not.
Very, very much. I mean, should we pay them more?
I think pay in itself, the idea of raising pay is to attract talent. That's what you hear, right? You hear it with bankers and stuff like that a lot of the time. So, I mean, instinctively, I'm not against raising pay to attract talent in certain professions if it works, but I don't know if that's working in politics specifically. Why? Because I think a lot of people that aren't naturally into politics, like you were saying earlier, like scientists, mathematicians, people from the private sector, I think some of the dysfunction they perceive within government about pushing through projects and project management essentially turns them off, even if the pay is good.
That's an interesting point.
I think a lot of the life of an MP, is taking criticism, a lot of flack in the media. Your personal life's pretty much out there. I think that puts a lot of people off as well. So I don't know if pay itself can improve the quality.
Yeah,
of
it does.
politicians.
It sounds quite simplistic to suggest, if you paid them, if you doubled the pay, right? Okay, that you suddenly get a flood of scientists wanting to become MPs or work in some sort of political, or even try to help the government. It might sound a bit too simplistic that. So pay is an issue, but it's not necessarily something that's easy to solve, and that it will immediately drive up the quality of our MPs. So I'm thinking.
But who introduced salary for them? Someone introduced it relatively recently, like in the past 100 years or so. Yeah,
it escapes me. It's been one where there are some arguments about this. It links in with experience, which is another interesting area. What experience do our MPs have? Is it better to have essentially older MPs because they've got more experience? First of all, what do we think to that? Do MPs need experience?
I'd say so. I mean, I suppose that's the Lords in essence, isn't it? That's the reason why you have the Lords. In theory, is because you're appointing people to it, like Michael Heseltine, who you've been in politics for all of your life, and you're experienced, you know it like the back of your hands, and you go into the Lords and you help make law because you know how to make law best. I suppose the problem with experience, I was having a conversation with my dad about this yesterday. How do you get that? How do you get that technocratic system? To become democratic in a sense.
Yeah, it's difficult. I suppose. Would it be better then that you have some experience, some youth, a whole mixture of things? Does that make it more representative? So then we get on to the interesting issue: do people realise how people get to become MPs? Let's just go through that. We don't want to get bogged down in this. But it would be worth just maybe shedding some light on how you get to become an MP. Mr. Cook, I'm getting vibes that you'll be all over this. You'll know the ins and outs of this. So, how do you get to become an MP?
Well, from what I've seen, a lot of the time it does depend on the party machine. So if you don't have, not contacts per se, but if you don't have a track record of working with the party, loyalty to the party, it's unlikely you're going to get selected.
So you've got to be a member of a party,
you've got to be a member,
and then you've got to gain favour or some
it's the constituency
position within it, foothold within that local party, perhaps, or the party itself.
Yeah. So there's plenty of so in 1923-4, Churchill stood as independent in London, and the Tories wouldn't have him, basically, or the Liberals, because he annoyed both sides essentially to such an extent. So he stood as independent and did terribly. Why? Because he didn't have the party machine behind him, didn't have the campaigners, the leafleters, knocking doors and stuff like that. It was a one-man band. So I think if you're not...
So it's who you know?
Partly. I mean, I'm not defending him, but Peter Hitchens has tried to run as a Tory MP repeatedly, and he constantly gets turned down because he's simply not in line.
He's a maverick, isn't he?
He's a maverick, right? They're not going to pick Peter Hitchens.
Yeah. So that can be interesting, how you gain favour, how you gain a position, and then you get a selection committee, don't you? Really, that you have to impress, and they will pick you to be potentially a candidate for that constituency. Let's just we're fast forwarding certain steps here, aren't we? But then obviously if you are a Conservative MP, and this is generally fitting within usual patterns, and you get the nomination, and for example a constituency I know quite well, Leeds West is where I grew up. It's like, good luck to you there if you're a Conservative, because you're not really in with much chance. So you need to get then a better place, don't you? A better constituency, where what I mean by better is you've got more chance of winning. So it's quite tricky, isn't it, to get through all those steps, and then we end up with a certain type of people at the end who get elected. Should we be making an effort? Should the system create a more representative set of people? And what I mean by that is representative right across the board: identity, gender, race, age, you name it. Because I'm assuming in that we kind of realise it's still unrepresentative.
Links quite well to... I'm not sure how the democratic systems can make a more representative and more diverse parliament, but obviously you link it back to late 2000s when David Cameron became leader, and he made it a more diversified. That's why you've got Theresa May, Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng. The Conservative Party right now is far more representative than the Labour Party, even though it is far more conservative.
Those shortlists, wasn't there? I think
Cameron did. Yeah, he did. He did do that. It's an interesting one. So to do that, you've got to be quite forceful. It could be sometimes referred to as, I don't know if it's still referred to as positive discrimination, where you would, could be female-only shortlists or certain quotas that it has to be certain, or people from all different backgrounds. Should there be enough people to choose from and who want to become an MP? What about, there's lots of issues here. So one of the reasons that perhaps people, our politicians are getting worse, we don't trust that lot, is they're out of touch. Are politicians out of touch? Is that a fair criticism?
I think so. I guess I hesitate to say that because I think that being out of touch it's not necessarily, just because you're not on the same pay scale as a member of the public doesn't mean that you can't necessarily understand or solve their problems, right? So immediately I think of Rishi Sunak, right? He's apparently the richest politician we've ever had in history, even when you adjust for inflation and stuff. But he literally has in his office a huge plasma screen TV with all the Bloomberg market charts on it, 24/7, constantly, all hours a day.
You mean you don't have one? I've got one of mine. No, I haven't.
So he clearly can read and follow markets, for instance, and gilts and stuff like that, which is really relevant now. And then you've got someone else like, let's say, Jeremy Corbyn, who's on a lot less money, and he's quite a simplistic guy. I quite admire his asceticism, right? But
And he wore nice caps.
Wore nice caps.
He did
It's a
wear
nice
nice
allotment.
caps, yeah,
He makes
yeah.
nice,
I'm always
cucumber
admiring of a
sandwiches.
good cap.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But he clearly didn't understand what people, not what they wanted, because people probably do. You look at Perling, people do seem to support nationalising the railways, but overall, for an agenda, what people were looking for in a leader.
Yeah, but I suppose then, if you are out of touch, you get rejected, perhaps. I mean, was Boris Johnson in touch? He's credited largely with certainly helping, contributing, leading perhaps the Conservative Party to a pretty sizable majority at the last election. Is that because Boris Johnson was in touch with the common man or woman or person? Finn?
No.
Finn, a resounding no.
Well,
yeah.
I don't. This England is on. It's like Sky.
I finished
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
You'd like it.
I've 3 in.
Yeah.
2 in.
alright.
2 or 3 in. Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
enjoying it.
At the start of it, it's just on holiday. It's the Prime Minister.
Oh, where is
you
it?
know,
Maldives or something, yeah.
Yeah, it's just...
Mystique,
it's
I
just,
think.
There we go, Mystique.
Isn't
yeah.
it because Churchill went there, though? I think it is.
He
I
did,
think
didn't
it
he,
is. I think it
Mystique,
is.
yeah.
Yeah.
I read, my granddad sent me an article a couple of weeks ago. It was like the Batsman, like in the Times, and it made a good point. You know, Johnson had this vision of Britain as being quite a diverse, multicultural place where you go to the theatre and, you know, it's quite a liberal view of Britain. It's quite, you know, it's quite harmonious. But it's sort of like, by way of supporting Brexit, that directly contradicted the Johnsonian view of Britain, because Brexit was about being protectionist, it was about being insular. You know, we are British and we are great, and you know that contradicts his view. So I think from day one, he as a prime minister was flawed, and that's if you don't take into account the fact that he was just a lazy man. You know, he was he.
That's
he
Finn's
had the-
view. Yeah.
But he had entitlement, didn't he? You know, he was born, and
Yeah, I
from-
mean, Boris doesn't. Sorry, I didn't want to. But I mean, Boris doesn't strike you as, you know, his background, which we've talked about, Etonian, classicist. It's not the most obvious route for someone who is regarded as in touch, anyway, is it?
No.
So
He's bred to believe that he is above the rest of the people.
But then they just flip it over, because one of the criticisms of Keir Starmer, the current leader of the Labour Party, is that he struggles to connect to people. I mean, we're slightly on different things here, whether that, you know, still Keir Starmer might have certain attributes that make a good politician, but it's just, I suppose, out of touch. Are they out of touch with what people think and want? Or maybe that's just trying to gauge what will people vote for. But
Exactly.
it's a similar field, isn't it? But not exactly the same. But that's one that's levelled at him, which then may be used for. We're quick to generalise, aren't we? They're all like that from there. I'm going to throw a few other people out there though, because I think they're in it for themselves. Our politicians in it for themselves. Okay, my hunch on that is that's a really unfair criticism. I don't think the majority are.
I think Boris was. I think
Yes.
that's why, and I think that's. Sorry to just jump back kind of quickly.
No, it's okay.
That's what you said.
All roads lead to Boris. It
All roads
seems
lead to
today,
Johnson.
yeah.
Well, you said about it conflicting with his liberal vision. I think because he clearly isn't empathetic to people. I don't think Boris. I don't think he looks at people and goes, "I want to help them." He looks at people and goes, "Helping you is the path for me to be in the history books, right?" And I think rather than understanding people, he just had a really good data guy, Dominic Cummings, basically, who dug down into the data and figured out. These are our target audience. This is exactly what they want. We're going to craft a message that Boris can sell to them. I think that all came together basically to deliver them that 80 majority.
No, that's fair comment. There's a lot of things going on, aren't there? I think, is it the case that certain politicians and their image, because we are obviously aware of that, the media, social media, etc., tend to dominate and overshadow other politicians who do good things? I mean, one of my favourites, and we talked about her in a politics lesson recently, is Jess Phillips, the Labour MP for Birmingham, or a part of Birmingham,
I'd imagine. That.
She's from Birmingham anyway.
Yeah.
Now, one thing she does is, or she did, is after the Sarah Everard killing, where she was killed fairly recently by a member of the Metropolitan Police, is she read out in the House of Commons all the women who've been killed by men in the last year. You know, to me, that is a valuable contribution from a politician. and many people know about that, and Jess Phillips is quite good on social media, and many people do know. But I wouldn't imagine everyone's talking about that, and maybe that's just the nature of it. But there are quite a lot of, let's phrase it, backbench MPs out there who do good stuff.
Definitely, yeah.
And they get, are we fair to say that their work gets overshadowed?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'm not sure, unless the media is going to focus on it, an easy way around that. But I suppose people should just be aware that there are MPs, many MPs like that. I still don't, I remember an MP for Leeds North West who I didn't generally agree with, and had an interesting discussion in Sainsbury's about the nature of Edmund Burke and representation. You know what I'm like, Mr. Cook. But he was a Liberal Democrat MP, and he certainly tried, and he certainly cared, and you would never accuse him of being in it for himself. And I think it's just an unfair, to a degree, it's an unfair accusation from members of the public.
Well,
but it seems to stick.
Yeah, I'm not a Liberal Democrat, but Norman Lamb.
Yeah, I remember Norman
Lamb.
Yeah.
Norman Lamb. Sorry, I think Chris Bryant's another one who actually does a lot of work on the backbench and stuff like that.
Yeah, he certainly has. Yeah,
massively important. But like you said, it doesn't get reported because it's not the big tax.
I mean, even people like, is it like Johnny Mercer, the Conservative, as well?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah, they clearly do valuable roles. It's just, and you do hear about them, but just not very much. But maybe that's just the nature of it.
I wish more people like that would get into cabinet level, because it just seemed like they just never quite make it.
I suppose when talk to Philip Davies, who's our local MP. I don't like him, don't agree with him hardly anything. He's the bane of my life, but Philip Davies.
Finn's sort of sitting on the fence tonight, isn't he? I wish he'd really be a bit more open about this. Come on, Finn.
I'm taking inspiration from the BBC. Playing partiality. But Philip Davies, he took over Shipley, and it's relatively marginal seat. It sort of could go either way. I'd imagine at the next election it would go to Labour. He's Conservative, but Philip Davies said, "I'm not going to take any cabinet posts. I'm not going to try and move up in the ranks because I want to focus on my constituents." Philip Davies is, for the brief of being an MP, he's a fantastic MP. You go to him with a query or, I've got a problem, and he'll get straight back to you. Oh, it's sometimes in minutes. He's absolutely brilliant at that. He focuses on what he believes in, which is men's rights, which is,
him and Jess don't see eye to eye on that.
Ooh,
I think she laughed at him when he suggested it. Yeah.
But he focuses on what he believes in. He does what he believes in.
And that's a bit of an Edmund Burke. Here we go. I'm a fan of Edmund Burke. And the nature of representation is we expect an awful lot from these people, don't we? But they are people, and they will have a certain amount of views. And in a way, they're there to... They can't be expressions of everybody's views. They can't be delegates, perhaps, where you take everybody's considerations into account and then you're making your decisions, because it just can't work like that. And I think it's an easy criticism, perhaps, in the sort of defence of MPs to just say, oh, you're not listening to me, or you think this and that's different to me. But you think differently to Philip Davies, but you do recognise that he does a lot of the groundwork of what he needs to do as an MP, just has particular views.
That's an important skill, that, being able to step back and go, I disagree with them vehemently, but credit where credit's due.
Yeah, I mean, he's a good MP. There are, Jess Phillips is a good MP, just the same as Philip Davies is a good MP, and I think, we sometimes give them more stick than the due, really.
Yeah, and I think there's an awful lot of pressure on them. There's an awful lot of demands of their time. If they're in the north, if they've got a northern constituency, and particularly a family, the pressures of... I mean, I read one of the best political diaries of an MP, it's a bit outdated now, is Chris Mullins' A View from the Foothills. There's quite a lot of these that are he was in the New Labour MP, and you do New Labour government, and an MP from the sort of mid-90s, and don't know whether he's still in Parliament or he's stopped now, Chris Mullins. But really good insight. He just came across as tired a lot of the time. I just remember reading it thinking, when do you sleep? Because his phone calls in the middle of the night, taxis or cars to come and pick him up to go down here. He's got to be in London by such and such. And he was based in the North East. So, 250, 300-mile round trip, whatever it is, doing that every week, coming home on the weekends. But they come home and they have breaks, but they take all these papers with them. I know Margaret Thatcher isn't the best representative example, but, working well long into the night, things like that. The vast majority, I think, do commit a lot of time to it, and it's hard work. It sounds hard work. So maybe we just cut them a bit of slack a little bit. But I think maybe they've been scarred by the expenses scandal, and I know some MPs were sent to prison because of that. And that's fair comment for people to have a go, and we're entitled to have a go. But there's that adage, do we get the politicians we deserve?
It seems just, for them at least, downhill since Macmillan. Right, he was the first satire prime minister when people would draw Superman cartoons. We without flattering, I guess, but he'd go to play. There's a famous scene in The Crown where he goes to some sort of performance and they're taking the mick out of him. There used to be a lot more time for them. But I think it's what you said, basically. They've been scarred by all these events, the expenses scandal.
Yeah, and it's stuck, hasn't it? I think a lot. And then obviously you've got a backlash of populism.
We don't want to get
and corrupt the elite. The elite is all corrupt.
The liberal elite.
And that's worked against it, but then that's a very hard to define group, isn't it? This elite. And we then, seemingly one of the main leaders of that in our country is an Etonian, a classicist Etonian, and that's someone against it. It's confusing, isn't it? Okay, I've got a little thought experiment for you. Right, here we go. So, look. Let's change all this. Let's change all this, people, right? Let's do it differently. And if you're listening to this and got ideas on this, we'd love to hear your views on this. We're going to do it differently. We might still have to have MPs. We might. But look, elections, MPs, causing loads of problems, and we're having this debate about whether they're getting worse or not. And okay, so we'll just change the nature of it, and we'll draw lots. So we will draw lots. And then we will attend assemblies like you would have to do in juries. So if you get pulled for jury service, you have to go on a jury and decide about a criminal case. You're going to do it for potential laws, decisions, things that affect perhaps a local area, perhaps the country. We're going to draw lots and we're going to serve. We're going to do public service for a term. 6 months, a year, longer, I don't know. It's a thought experiment. I'm a bit loose with some of the details. What do we think to this?
I don't know. It's sort of it's a difficult one because obviously there's chance and luck and probability involved in it. So theoretically, you'll get a representative chunk of the population.
It'd solve that problem, wouldn't it? Well, it wouldn't necessarily solve it, would it? But it would improve.
Yeah. But then there could be the thing of there is still an equal chance that every single card you pull out of the bucket is like an old 70-year-old privately educated man, and you've just got it probably wouldn't happen, but there is a chance that could happen.
But then you would you could do it again, depending on what you said, how often you did it.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be a degree of chance.
But there's also, you also bring the thing of, are they actually properly experienced? Are they, do they know about these things? Are they well equipped enough in terms of intelligence to be able to know what all of these things are? Or have you basically got an idiot in the job? Do you want an idiot legislating?
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it comes over the diversity thing, right, pretty well. It would be pretty representative, and I think anyone out disagreeing would find it hard to make an argument in that system. But I think one thing that's missing from politics right now is long-term planning project. I think throwing it up with new people, you might not even get the skill set that will
because you're constantly moving who's the personnel.
Yeah, you might get some duffers, you know what I mean, that have been put in charge of
plenty of
HS2, right, or something like that. I think one thing we need to focus on in this country is skills and getting people into the job with actual skills to manage projects that are large scale, can abstract models in their heads, have cognitive tools for dealing with high. So Liz Truss, I imagine her getting the nuclear codes and just flatlining, basically. Like, she can't comprehend it in her head that she's now in charge of nuclear warheads.
Yeah.
Interesting. We can't say anything to that, Mr. Cook. We're all worried about nuclear war now. You've taken us to a dark place.
There is a great... I'll get a quote in. A Hennessy quote, Peter Hennessy, great British political academic. He said, I can't remember it off by heart, but it says something like, the perfect Prime Minister has the sleep requirements of a Thatcher.
Yeah, I think I remember
organisational
seeing this
capacity
years
of a
ago.
Tony Blair, the speaking of a Churchill,
Yeah.
the charisma of a Harold Wilson.
So if you're designing your ideal PM or even your ideal politician, you just can't, can you? You
Yeah,
just can't
freak.
get
You'd have a
this
freak in
person
nature,
doesn't exist.
He's sleeping like 2 hours a night.
Look, where this takes me is it's back to that. Look, I'm not going to sit here and say democracy is overrated, but then you were talking about skills and getting the people with the requisite skills in the job. So then you may talk about, for example, like the pandemic, where you want scientists and people with essential sort of data skills in the job. So appoint them in there. But when you start doing that, and they get the power to do it, to make decisions, you're moving away from democracy. Now, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that it looks like that, and that's the tension, isn't it? Look, people might not have liked having Boris Johnson in charge when the pandemic was on, but there was at least an element of democracy behind that, and other things can seem better, but they might not necessarily work out that way. It's certainly something to think about.
I think that's the thing with democracy, isn't it? It's that fundamentally democracy is flawed, because if you put leaders up for election, democracy, it doesn't necessarily mean that the best leader is going to be elected. You could argue that Boris Johnson wasn't the best man to lead our country at that time. You could argue, although this is a very radical argument, that Liz Truss isn't the best person to lead our country at the moment. I suppose in that sense it's fundamentally flawed, but the thing I think about democracy is that there is a reason why we have democracy. There is a reason why countries are turning towards democracy, and that's because it's the best system. It's
or the least worst.
Yeah.
That's the quote, isn't it? Yeah, the least worst. Which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So, like, there are these flaws, and perhaps a flaw is we have a debate about are our politicians getting worse. But I suppose maybe the last thing we think about is what's the alternative? We've explored a few alternatives, haven't we? And we might be thinking there's big problems there, perhaps.
I'm not advocating this, but there is... Because it's not either you have democracy or not, is it? It's kind of pooling it, right? It's like we have a bit more like... We have less democracy, arguably, than Switzerland, where they have referendums a la carte, right? We don't have them over here, but we're still democratic. But I think there is a danger if democratic politicians don't get their act together. You're seeing it in the youth now. There are some elements of under 30s who look at China and go, interesting.
If your system works, if you make people richer,
Who's happy?
if it's clear,
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah.
It's like, I think it brings it on, going back to Italy. We talked about Italy last week, but Italy obviously constantly has government collapses. So the last government they brought in, a man called Mario Draghi, the president just appointed him and said, right, you're going to be prime minister. So he's been like really experienced with the economy. He's been...
I mean, he was a former banker, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
ECB head as well.
Yeah, he was, wasn't he? So
really,
if you're talking about
really big
experience,
guy.
there's your man.
Yeah, and so he came in and, yes, he's an old, over 70s white man, but he did a brilliant job. He was a brilliant prime minister. Italians were almost universally like, oh God, this guy is absolutely brilliant, because he got the economy back on track. He sorted COVID out. He was clear. There was clarity. But he wasn't elected. And that's the problem, because he was appointed the leader. So, technocratic leadership is obviously going to be the best leadership. But there's always a problem of, it's not democratic.
So we've just got to maybe hope, maybe pray, I don't know. Maybe hope that people of different backgrounds do want to get involved in politics. So basically, I'm putting an appeal out to all math teachers who are listening to become MPs, aren't I? Because we need, your country needs you.
Your country needs you.
Country needs you.
Come on, Mr. Morrissey.
I know Mr. Morrissey is sometimes listens to this. Mr. Morrissey, we think you should become an MP. Yeah. And we'll offer our help, won't we? But it's a serious note, isn't it? You need that. We talked about that, and it's an interesting debate. So I think, to sum up then, we're not going to necessarily buy into this, they're getting worse. It does seem a bit of an easy stick to beat them with, but there are a few issues out there with the people who run the show, but maybe that's part and parcel of a democracy. But do you want something else instead? There you go.
Yeah, these are the questions
Silence
for the philosophers, right?
Yeah. Well, let us know if you've got a thought on that. What do you think about politicians? Are they getting worse? Any ideas on that? What do you think about democracy? What do you think about some of the issues that we've discussed today?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'd also like to hear your perfect politician.
Yeah. We're interested.
Design a politician.
Build a politician
workshop.
Yeah. If you've got anyone in mind who you think fits that bill, if you've met someone, if you are that person, come forward. Yeah, that'd be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Interesting.
What does a perfect politician look like? Yeah, that's a great idea.
Have we just said it's Mr. Morrissey?
We think it's Mr. Morrissey. Yeah. Some people might think it is different. So there we go. We can hopefully, please give us some ideas, and we'll talk about them next week.
Cracking stuff.
Right, that's great. Thank you very much. Cheers for listening.
Thank you for joining us.
Bye.